Strawberries are one of the first sweet fruits that ripen in the spring. They can be grown in ground, in pots, or in raised beds. I'll show you the best planting methods for the best production and the sweetest flavor. Strawberries are best planted in the spring when the days have warmed and the soil can be worked. But in some areas, warmer climate areas, they can be planted in fall for earlier production. When picking out your strawberries, you'll need to know that they fall into 4 main categories: June-bearing, ever-bearing, day-neutral, and alpine strawberries. June-bearing strawberries will produce one main crop that usually lasts anywhere from 3 to 5 weeks, depending on your area. Our June-bearing strawberries here will actually start to produce the end of April and go to the first week in June. So if you have a warmer area like we do, they definitely produce earlier. I think they're the biggest and they are very sweet. They also produce a lot of runners, and this is a good thing, but I'll go over that later. Ever-bearing strawberries will produce 2 to 3 main crops. They'll still produce in between those crops, it's just a lesser amount. They aren't quite as big or as sweet as the June-bearing, but still better than anything you'll find in the store. Day-neutral strawberries produce a lot like ever-bearing strawberries, but they're more suited for cooler climates and shadier areas. They'll actually start to produce when the temperatures are as low as 35 degrees, but they don't send out as many runners and they're definitely not as sweet. And then there's the alpine strawberries. You don't typically find these in nurseries, but you can grow them from seed. They're very small and they're very seedy, but these are the sweetest of all the strawberries. Strawberries are traditionally a woodland plant. They tolerate the shade, but they'll definitely produce more when given sun. They need at least 8 hours of sun a day. In areas where you have warm summers that are 95 degrees or warmer, some afternoon shade would be really beneficial. Soil is key when growing strawberries. They love humus. They can grow in almost pure leaf mold like they do in the wild. To prepare your soil, incorporate plenty of well-rotted manure or compost. And I like to add 3 to 4 inches, and I work this in deeply. Strawberries really like well-drained, loose soil. Any soil can be amended, including clay, but clay will take the most work. It doesn't drain well and strawberries don't like that. If it stays too soggy, then the strawberries have a tendency to rot. For heavy clay soils, you can add perlite or vermiculite to those soils and incorporate it deeply. That creates better drainage. And then you go ahead and add your manures and your compost to that. Or you can just build a raised bed box and fill it full of good soil. Strawberries are potash hungry. That's potassium, and you can find it in things like chicken manure. Chicken manure is a really good source for it, and if you want to learn about making it, I'll put a link below. Some other really good sources is Greensand, and it's good for all soil types. Another good option for acidic soils is wood ash. It's high in potash as well, but don't be using it in alkali soils because it can raise your pH a little bit more. I'll apply Greensand the end of February because this is when we start to get our first blossoms of our strawberry. Greensand will really help the overall health of the plant. It improves the flavor, helps them actually be a little bit more heat resistant, and it also helps with disease control. There's 2 ways that you can buy strawberries. One is bareroot, and you can find these at nurseries or you can mail order these. And basically they're just meaning that they are bare roots. There is no soil around them. And when you get them, you want to make sure that they are viable, that they have a little bit of growth on top here, and that the roots are healthy. Sometimes they'll come just a little bit on the dry side, so you'll definitely want to soak these in something. Some water or some worm compost tea or even some kelp tea. These are all great to just plump them up to give them off to a good start. Then there's also the transplants. These are a little bit easier. They're not quite as persnickety, and these are great for beginners. The planting depth of your strawberries is crucial. Too shallow and the strawberry plants can dry out, but too deep, then they can actually rot. So we want to plant them right at the crown level, and that's just this darkened area right here between the roots and the stem. When planting your bare roots, you'll want to spread those roots out just a little bit. Create your hole, and if you can, just put a little mound in the middle and spread your strawberry roots over the top of that, and then bring the soil level into that. Then water them in at this point. The water will probably settle that dirt a little bit, and if your roots are still exposed, then you can add just a little bit more dirt at that time. But if your crown is covered, then just slightly pull up on your strawberry, just shaking it just a little bit, just to bring it to the right level. When planting transplants, it should be just a little bit easier, but you always want to check the depth of what your transplant has been planted. On this guy, some of the roots are just a little bit exposed and he's kind of cocked sideways. So I want to put him in there to where he's just right and cover those roots up just a little bit. Space your strawberries anywhere from 8 to 12 inches. This allows them enough room that they can propagate new strawberries, and they don't like to be crowded as well. And I like to put mine on a diagonal, that way I can fit more in a small space. Here's the loaded question. How many strawberries will you need? Well, it all depends. Do you like strawberries or do you love strawberries? Are you just going to snack on them or do you want to make jam? But a general good rule of thumb is 6 to 10 strawberry plants per person. There's no need to fertilize at transplanting time. The compost or the well-rotted manure will provide enough. You'll want to fertilize after 2 weeks of transplanting. This is when the roots have started to develop and we might be starting to get blossoms, and this is the perfect time to be fertilizing. Drip irrigation is the best way to water strawberries. Too much watering from the top, especially when the strawberries are starting to ripen, can cause those strawberries to actually mold. That being said, if you live in an area where you get a lot of rain and your strawberries do mold, you'll want to pick those off and discard them because that can just harbor and cause disease. Keep weeds out of your strawberry beds. They don't like to compete for water or nutrients. A lot of times you'll find strawberries as a companion plant for other plants. And that's fine if you don't intend on getting strawberries because they'll compete for the sun and then they don't produce very good. However, I will plant rhubarb on the ends of the beds that aren't interplanted with my strawberries because they actually like the same soil and the same nutrients and the same water. Mulch your strawberries to help keep the moisture in the soil cooler, which strawberries really like, and help keep the weeds out. You can use things like straw, hence the name strawberries, or you could use like a Happy Frog soil conditioner or a cotton burr, which is actually really good for alkali soils. Black plastic is not a good choice to be using as a mulch or to keep weeds out. It heats the soil up too much and the strawberries won't produce well, especially if you live in a hotter climate. Sow-bugs, slugs, and snails can be a real problem, especially if you mulch with straw because they like to hide underneath that straw. They love those strawberries just as much as we do, but you can control these by doing either beer traps for the slugs and snails, but I like to use Sluggo Plus because it controls all the crawling insects and those slugs and snails, and just sprinkle it over the top and it's perfectly fine for organic gardens. It just contains iron phosphate, which just turns into a fertilizer, and the spinosad, which is perfectly safe. When planting from bare root strawberries, you're going to want to pick off the first few weeks of the blooms that they produce. This will encourage a better root system, and in the long run, you're going to have bigger berries and a healthier plant. When planting from a transplant, you actually don't even need to pick off those blossoms. It's generally a more established plant and already has a pretty good root system that can support it. Strawberries grow great in pots. They're really beautiful in hanging baskets because the runners hang down and they'll bloom just off of those runners that dangle down. They're also really pretty in large ceramic pots. You can put them in pretty shallow pots, at least 6 inches of depth though. But remember, the smaller the pot, the faster they're going to dry out. And if you live in a hot environment, then make sure you're picking a lighter colored pot to keep the roots cool for those strawberries. Use a good potting soil, one that holds moisture, and that'll be really helpful. You can actually plant your strawberries just a little bit closer when you're growing in pots. 3 per square foot is just perfect. You'll plant your strawberries in these pots the same way you do in the ground. In very cold regions, you're probably going to want to move your pots in a garage or a covered porch just to protect them so that they don't freeze too hard. But don't forget to water them through the wintertime. When we grow strawberries in pots, we're going to need to fertilize a little bit more often because we're watering more often and the nutrients get leached out. So I like to use a liquid bloom fertilizer every 2 weeks to keep that production up high during the growing season. If you're finding this useful, click the like, subscribe, and hit the bell for notifications of our new video content. In hot climates, strawberries will slow their production. Plus, their flavor isn't quite as sweet as it is in the spring and fall. This is really a natural occurrence. Feeding strawberries should be done when they first start to bloom and then every 4 to 6 weeks after. This really helps plump up those berries and makes them much sweeter. I'll use an acid mix fertilizer because our soil is alkali here and strawberries prefer a little bit acidic soil. If you live in a place where your soil is already acidic, then just use a well-balanced fertilizer so you don't alkalize that soil anymore. If you didn't want to use a dry fertilizer, you could use a liquid bloom fertilizer, and this works excellent. But you'll want to fertilize a little more often because it isn't as strong or doesn't last as long as your dry fertilizer. And the nice thing is, if your plants are lacking, then this is great to pour right over those leaves to give them a little bit of a boost and get them producing to their fullest. Make sure that you keep your soil moist but not soggy, especially during the flowering and fruiting stages of the summer months. If you want to propagate more strawberries, well, it's pretty easy and they do it pretty much on their own. June-bearing and ever-bearing strawberries will produce runners. And these are stolons. These are like stems that reach out from the mother plant. They develop a few inches away, sometimes a little bit more. They get leaves on them, and then wherever they touch the soil, they'll develop a root system. To help encourage the production of runners, then you can remove the flowers from the mother plant. But remember, when you remove the flowers from the mother plant, you're removing your berry production. So what I like to do is actually take a couple of plants, remove the flowers, let them produce runners or our new plants, and then leave the rest for berry production. Any of those runners that haven't rooted by September 1st, then go ahead and cut them off. That way all of that energy can be put back into that mother plant so that she can have a good root system to survive the winter. Now it's time for you to get your beds prepared for a productive strawberry growing season, and I'll see you in our next episode.